Hey YouTube, welcome back to another episode of Ball Pythons A through Z. I'm Stack, and in today's episode, we're going to be covering basic housing and temperature and humidity regulation for your ball python. Depending on the size of your ball python, there's a couple different size terrariums that you can use to house your ball python. For babies or anything up to about half a year to a year old, you can use a 10-gallon tank. This is the smallest tank you can use, but if you want to see growth in your ball python, you're going to need something a little bit bigger. Some people recommend upping your terrarium size every year or so. I am not really a big advocate of that. It's kind of expensive unless you manage to find one on Craigslist or something. So as soon as you move them out of the baby habitat, go ahead and put them into either a 30-gallon or a 40-gallon terrarium, and that should allow for proper growth and allow you to do a couple other key things for your ball python. The reason you're going to want these larger tanks is to provide your ball python with something called a temperature gradient. Now, ball pythons are reptiles, so they're cold-blooded and need an external heat source to keep themselves warm. What a temperature gradient is it's an area of the cage where it's hot and an area of the cage where there is no heat source. The reason behind this is it allows your ball python to thermoregulate, which is to control its own body temperature. If it gets too warm, it'll move over to the cold side of the enclosure. If it gets too cold, it'll move over to the warm side of the enclosure. The use of a temperature gradient allows you to figure out exactly what your ball python likes and where your heat should be. Now you may be asking, when do I know when I've got the temperature dialed in? Well, if you have a good amount of heat on one side and you're using that temperature gradient, you should see your snake moving back and forth from different hides, from the warm hide to the cold hide. If he's moving back and forth, that means he's thermoregulating, which means you've got a good set of temperatures in there for him. Now, there is a lot of discrepancy out there on the internet about how warm your ball python's enclosure should be. I've seen everything from 95 degrees to 60 degrees, and none of that is really that accurate. Your safe zone is about 75 degrees to 95 degrees, and having that 20-degree difference will allow you to tinker with it and figure out what your ball python likes. Now, I've known snakes who like really, really warm environments and others who really don't prefer it, so it's going to be up to you to figure out exactly what your ball python needs. Again, you need that minimum temperature of at least 75 degrees, and you probably don't want to push 95 on the max, or you'll risk catching a fire inside your terrarium or hurting your snake. As far as humidity goes, this is pretty common snake husbandry. You're going to want a humidity between about 40 and 70% for good ball python health. And when they're shedding, you're going to want to up that humidity to as close to about 90% to allow for a cleaner shed. There's a couple ways you can tinker with the humidity inside of your enclosure to raise it when you need to raise it. And one really easy way I found, even though it is labor intensive, is to place a wet towel over the top of the enclosure, leaving a little bit of space for airflow. And that seems to work pretty well. It doesn't make any condensation form on the inside of the tank, which you don't want. That'll create mold and get your ball python sick. It's a pretty safe way of doing it. The other way that's really common is to use something called scandium moss. And what that is it's a sanitary moss you can pick up at any pet store that you can soak with water, squeeze out anything that's going to drip, and place it inside of the enclosure. And that'll gradually release that moisture into the air and keep the environment humid. And this moss, it's pretty cheap. It's not that expensive. You can buy it, again, pretty much anywhere. Looks like that. It's this brown stuff in here. And a good way I found of applying it is to put it inside of a ceramic flower pot. Soak the pot in the moss and water, squeeze the water out of the top, and place the entire thing in there. And that'll give you a double whammy of humidity. The moss will be releasing the moisture, and the ceramic garden pot will also be releasing moisture over time. Next, we're going to talk about the different types of substrate that you can use in your snake's enclosure. Now, the best thing that I've found in my experience is an aspen wood chip bedding. Now, the aspen is the best kind of bedding because it doesn't produce any oil, it's easy to clean, and it's absorbent. Those are the three things you want in a substrate. Using things like newspaper and paper towels, it may be a little bit easier to clean, but you're going to have to do it much more frequently, and there's a higher chance of your terrarium smelling bad. A side note on the substrate, you don't want to use any kind of cedar when you're coming up with a bedding for your snake. It excretes a harmful oil that'll give them a rash that can become infected and it can actually kill your snake. You really don't want that. The aspen bedding kind of looks like this. You can get it anywhere. It doesn't need to be the snake-specific brand that they have for sale in the snake aisles. You can just get a brick of this stuff, any pet store. It's like $5, real cheap. It's clean, and it's the best kind of bedding. I actually have it in my terrarium behind me that I'm going to be showing you guys in a minute, and that should be pretty helpful. The last thing we're going to talk about in this video is the basic setup you're going to need for your ball python tank. When you set it up, you're going to need a couple key things in there. The first one, obviously, being a water dish. Second, you're going to want at least 2 hide boxes, one on the warm side of the tank and one on the cold side of the tank. You're also going to need a temperature gauge and a humidity gauge. So here's an example of your basic ball python setup. You've got your aspen bedding in there, your water dish. I have a couple hides thrown around the exterior, the interior of the tank. You can see the temperature and humidity gauge there down over by the rock. I actually tossed in a few extra things into my terrarium. You can see those ceramic pots there that I used for maintaining humidity. I've got some foliage back there. They seem to like that. I mean, you can even see Mambo back there right now. He's kind of hiding over there by the dish with his head poking out, sticking out under the fake foliage. Got the 2 hide boxes on the warm and cold side of the tank at least. Here's the first one. I just used a router box. Cardboard lets in heat and traps it pretty well. It's a good thing to have on the warm side. Over here, I have one of those fake logs for the cold side of the tank that he seems to enjoy pretty well. The more hide boxes you have inside of a ball python terrarium, the happier they're going to be. They like being able to hide and be out of sight. The system I've got set up is pretty simple. I've got 2 100-watt bulbs here on the warm side of his tank in one of the double ZoomEd lamps. It's kind of labor intensive to manually turn the lights on and off every time you need to screw with the day-night settings for your ball python. So I have these automatic timers set up over here that determine the day and night cycle, and those are pretty cheap. You can pick them up at any hardware store for around $5 or $10 depending on the kind you get. Digitals are always more reliable. I would recommend getting those. I wouldn't recommend picking up any kind of physical timer. It's going to create some pretty serious problems for you. They get out of sync a lot easier than the digital ones. As far as bulbs go, the daytime bulbs can be anything you can pick up from a pet store. There's a lot of ones. Depending on the size of your enclosure, you're going to need a couple different wattages. I would recommend just buying a couple, tinkering with them, and returning the ones that don't work. The nighttime bulbs are a little trickier. You can buy those special light ones that the snakes can't see, but you can see. It's kind of a purplish light. It's common in reptile shops. But what I would recommend getting, and what I have, are these things called ceramic bulbs. They look like this. They last a long time. I've had this bulb since I got Mambo all those years ago, and it's been a trooper for me. The reason I don't have it in right now is because it's winter over here. It gets a little colder, so I up the wattage to a different bulb to keep them a little warmer in the evening. That's the end of this episode of Ball Pythons A through Z. This was our housing and temperature and humidity episode. In the next one, we're going to talk about basic feeding procedures for your ball python. If you like the video, go ahead and give it a thumbs up. Leave a comment below if you have any questions, and I'll get back to you when I can. Have a great night.